Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our first biweekly forum of the Black History Month. And we are excited to host this important conversation today on race and racism at this moment and looking at it through a historical context. And we're happy that you've all taken time out of your day on this cold February day to join us. We meet here every other Thursday from 11 a.m. to 12:15 p.m., although some of our speakers stay afterwards if they can. Out of caution during the pandemic, we've decided to move our forum to this online webinar format in order to promote public safety and to make our forums more accessible. Just a few notes about this new format that we feel you should be made aware of. First, everyone except the forum presenters and Kerwin staff are muted in terms of audio and video, so don't worry about having to mute yourself or deal with any video settings. No one will be able to hear you or see anyone except the speakers. Also, the chat feature has been disabled for this webinar, but we encourage you to make use of the Q&A button to ask questions or raise concerns about the webinar, and we'll work with those and answer questions in the Q&A at the appropriate time. Someone from the Kerwin will be monitoring the Q&A and will help with any problems with the webinar, and we'll also collect questions at the end. Finally, this webinar is being recorded so that we can make that available through our social media afterwards. Though no one except the presenters will be recorded, we want to make everyone aware of that ahead of time, just for the sake of transparency. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Hasan Jeffries, who will be sharing their knowledge and experience on the subject of race and racism today. A little bit about Dr. Jeffries. Hasan Kwame Jeffries is an associate professor in the Department of History at The Ohio State University and a faculty affiliate of the Kerwin Institute. His teaching and research focus on the 20th and 21st century African-American history. He's the author of Bloody Lounge, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, and the editor of Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement. He earned his BA from Morehouse College and PhD from Duke University. So now I will turn things over to Dr. Jeffries for his presentation and to begin the webinar.
Thank you very much, Kip. I appreciate the introduction, and to everyone at the Kerwin Institute, from Director Beverly, Dr. Van Diver on down, for the invitation to share some thoughts and ideas to continue to partner and collaborate on these important topics and subjects. And of course, thank you to everyone who is out there, who has taken the time out this afternoon to think deeply about race and racism in American society, the pressing issues of the day. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a few slides I want to share with you all, a few images, a few text slides I want to share with you all. Take us to about 11:45 or so, and then I want to open it up for your questions. So we have someone who will be monitoring the Q&A. So by all means, as questions and thoughts come to mind, please put them in there, and so that we can get to them by the end. Now, let me go ahead and share my screen. I've titled my remarks for this afternoon, Making Sense of the Moment, Putting Race and Racism in Historical Context. Making sense of the moment, putting race and racism in historical context. As a professional historian, as a trained historian, I want to begin talking about today by talking about yesterday. In 1873, during the height of Reconstruction, really near the tail end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, of course, for those of you who remember your U.S. history classes, Reconstruction was that moment in American history after emancipation, after the Civil War. 4 million enslaved African Americans are now free, and they are struggling to define what freedom is. And they are working sometimes in partnership with Northern whites, sometimes in opposition with Northern whites who had their own vision of what freedom was, but certainly working in a hostile environment. Former Confederates, former enslavers, white Southerners were hostile to the very idea of African Americans being able to determine their own destiny. Well, in Louisiana, in Colfax, Louisiana, which is in Grant Parish, just a couple hours northwest of New Orleans and Baton Rouge, African Americans, in coalition with a number of former white Union officers, white Republicans, a small handful, still retain control over state government and many local governments. By 1873, only 3 states still were under Reconstruction governments. Only 3 states were still pursuing policies that sought to not return African Americans to as near a state of slavery as possible, but sought to redefine what American citizenship ought to look like and ought to be. Louisiana was one of those states. Well, in 1873, after a very close election, but election that was decisively won by Republicans, not only in Grant Parish, but really across the state, including the governorship, a collection of local white men decided that they were going to form a terrorist group patterned after the Ku Klux Klan. The whites, they called themselves the Knights of the White Chameleon. They were going to form this group patterned after the Klan, which had just been formed a few years earlier in Tennessee, and that they were going to march on the parish courthouse, the county courthouse, if you will, the parish courthouse, and they were going to remove the duly elected government that included African American men who had been enfranchised with the 15th Amendment and were able to vote and hold public office, and their handful of white allies. When some brothers, former Union officers, received or heard word about these white men marching on the county courthouse, the parish courthouse, they armed up and headed down to the courthouse themselves. And they positioned themselves in a defensive, they took up defensive positions on the inside as well as the outside to defend the courthouse, and more importantly, to defend their right to participate in the political process and to defend democracy. See, what was being contested here, the reason why these whites were even marching on the county courthouse is they said that this election was illegitimate because Black folk had participated in it. Although emancipation had occurred, although the 15th Amendment to the Constitution had been passed, granting the right to African American men to vote, to participate in the political process, most white Southerners still clung to an enslaver's mentality. An enslaver's mentality. This idea that white labor, the fruits of Black labor, belong to white people, and that African Americans did not have a legitimate claim to participate in the body politic. That although the 15th Amendment said certainly the African American men had the right to vote, that in this post-emancipation period, you still had Southern whites clinging to this enslaver's mentality, clinging to this idea articulated by Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney in the 1857 Dred Scott decision, that African Americans have no rights which the white man is bound to respect, including the right to vote. And so the fact that you could have an election and a government turn on African American ballot, turn on African American votes, meant that that election meant that that government was illegitimate. And if that government was illegitimate, they were duty bound as believers in white supremacy to oust, to remove that government. And that's exactly what they attempted to do. And so on April 3rd, 1873, this collection of white men, several hundred armed with individual weapons, holdovers from the from the Civil War, armed with a Confederate issue cannon, march on this parish courthouse. And when they get there, they find African Americans in these defensive positions, and a gun battle ensues. African Americans, the Black men, are able to hold them off for quite a while. They sustain a number of injuries. 3 white men are killed when African Americans return fire, but eventually the brothers on the inside realize that they are both outnumbered and outgunned. And as a result of that, they decide to lay down their arms, to come out, to surrender, to say, okay, you know, you win, we can see the county courthouse. But that was not enough. When those Black men, some 150, exit that courthouse, they are all shot. After they stack their arms, they are all shot and murdered. And the handful of those Black men who had been on the inside, who had been wounded during the initial gun battle, they are hanged. In all, some 150 plus, as best numbers can be determined, were massacred that day. This was the Colfax massacre. Now, because the government of the state of Louisiana was still controlled by Republicans, and Ulysses S. Grant, Republican president, and still supportive of Reconstruction as much as possible, they send down troops. You actually have a number of arrests. Several hundred people or 90 some people are arrested, but there's only about 9 indictments or 90 some indictments, excuse me, only about 9 convictions. And those convictions eventually are overturned by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court at this time was moving away from protecting, as though it had ever really done so, but was clearly moving away from protecting the basic civil rights and human rights of African Americans. The Supreme Court said that you can't charge these insurrectionists, you can't charge these murderers, you can't charge the members of this lynch mob with violating the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment, in their interpretation, did not apply to the actions of individuals, but rather to the actions of the state. So in the end, 150 some African Americans are murdered or massacred in this attempt to overthrow a duly elected local government, and no one is held accountable. But as we move through time, as we move through history, this massacre, this attempted coup d'etat is reimagined in popular consciousness. And so this is the image before you is a historic marker erected by the Louisiana Department of Commerce and Industry, essentially sort of a booster, state of Louisiana booster organization. We all have those, every state. And they put this marker up on the site of the Colfax massacre in 1950. So some 75 years, about 75 years after it had occurred. And it reads, let me just read it real quick for those who are just listening in. It reads, Colfax riot. On this site occurred the Colfax riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13th, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Now, this historic marker really encapsulates what I call the typical response to hard history. And by hard history, I mean those aspects of our past, those aspects of the American experience that trouble us deeply. Those aspects of the past, whether we're talking about slavery or lynching or Jim Crow, that make us uncomfortable about the present, about where we are and how we have gotten there. And this massacre is an example of that. Racial terrorism. There's a long history of racial terrorism in the United States, and we have a long history of reimagining what that actually was. Because rather than confronting these difficult aspects of our past, we do one of 3 things. One, we just pretend it didn't happen. And so while we have this historic marker in most of our textbooks as we were kids growing up, there is no mention of the Colfax massacre. There is no mention of the Wilmington massacre in 1898, something very similar as whites stormed the African-American community in an effort to oust a Black and white coalition of duly elected officers in North Carolina's largest city at the time, killing some 60 and forcing out the duly elected government and putting in its place the leaders of the lynch mob. And we don't read about that. That's not the story that's a part of the narrative of the American experience. And certainly not the inclusion of the African-American experience in that broader context. The reason why we don't talk about Juneteenth, the reason why we don't talk about Tulsa, the reason why we don't talk about Rosewood or East St. Louis, we just pretend as though it didn't happen. But when we do acknowledge it in some way, shape, or form, then one of the things that we do is we just create false narratives. Suddenly, this clear massacre in which 150 people, African Americans, stack their arms and then are murdered, summarily executed, suddenly becomes a riot. There's a long history of us as Americans, as a nation, taking what are massacres and talking about them in the context of a riot, as though there was some equivalency between African Americans trying to defend democracy and their right to vote and then being summarily executed, and 3 white men dying during this attempted coup. So we create this false narrative, right? That this was somehow a riot. The biggest false narrative that we have in the last 150 years, 170 years or so, is the lost cause. The idea that the Confederacy was somehow about the preservation of Southern heritage as opposed to trying to maintain the institution of slavery rooted in a belief in white supremacy. That's just making stuff up, right? And it's just a false narrative, and we do it all the time. And the other thing that we do, we pretend it didn't happen, create false narratives. We attempt to rationalize away evil, right? This is a massacre in which 150 people died, and yet we see this attempt to rationalize it away by that last sentence. This event marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Carpetbag misrule in the South. This notion that somehow the presence and the participation of African Americans in the political process as voters, as duly elected public officials, resulted in corruption, resulted in misrule. And so this attempted coup was necessary in order to end this political malfeasance as a result of Black participation in the political process. Now, this is one example, 1873. But again, we see this time and time and time again throughout American history in the post-emancipation, post-slavery era. Wilmington becomes one of them. The riots continue, but often they're white riots directed at African Americans. So why am I starting with this? Why am I starting a conversation about race and racism today in America with a massacre that occurs more than a century ago, century and a half ago? That's because we just saw the same thing occur. The exact same thing occur. The Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021, for which the former president of the United States is currently on trial, an impeachment trial for, was rooted in the very same premises that we saw during the Colfax massacre in 1873. The big lie in 1873 was that African Americans were illegitimate in terms of, or the African American political participation was illegitimate, and therefore the government was illegitimate, served as the same premise for what we saw, what motivated, what catalyzed this attempt to overthrow the American government, right? To stop democracy, the full functioning, the peaceful transfer of power. This idea articulated literally on the run up to the election, and then articulated the night of the election as ballots were still being counted, and as a clear victor was being seen, or was emerging by the president of the United States, saying that this election was fraudulent, that there was massive fraud, and the echoes to Wilmington in 1898 and Colfax in 1873 are strong. Because it was rooted in the belief, the reason why this thing becomes believable to so many people, to so many white people, is that it is rooted in this idea that Black political participation is illegitimate, right? The problem wasn't votes that happened in rural Ohio or suburban Ohio. The problem was votes that were cast in Philadelphia, that were cast in Milwaukee, that were cast in Detroit, that were cast in Atlanta. The problem was Black folk voting. The very idea that Black folk could have a decisive role in the outcome of an election was abhorrent to those who believed in white supremacy, to those who were animated by white supremacy. And that's what we're dealing with. That's what we saw on January 6th. That's what we have seen since the 2016 election. This wasn't the creation of white supremacy. This was animating. Donald Trump tapped into the most powerful political ideology in American history, and that is the ideology of white supremacy. That is the most successful political organizing tool in American history, and that is racism and white supremacy. And Donald Trump embraced it and was able to animate millions of voters around it, millions of voters around it. And these are the same who showed up on the nation's capital, taking the lives of police officers in the process. And why, this was a shocking event. And this ties into how we got to understand race and racism in American society today. This was absolutely a shocking event. We had not seen Americans, citizens storm the Capitol in an attempted coup, right? An attempted insurrection, an attempt to forestall democracy, a peaceful transfer of power, and essentially create a dictatorship to keep one person in office who was not duly elected. This was shocking. Hadn't seen this before. But it wasn't surprising. It wasn't surprising if we know history, It wasn't surprising because we know about Colfax. It wasn't surprising if you remember Wilmington and Tulsa and Rosewood and East St. Louis and Detroit in 1943. It was not surprising if you have been paying attention to the ways in which Donald Trump and others have been using white supremacy in order to animate white Americans. It was not surprising if we have been paying attention to conservative politics over the last 40 years, going back to the rise of Ronald Reagan in 1980, when he chooses to launch his presidential campaign, former governor of California, not in California, not in Washington, D.C., but in Neshoba County, Mississippi. He announces his run for office for president of the United States in Neshoba County, Mississippi, and it's not by accident. His campaign bus wasn't on his way from DC to California and suddenly breaks down in Neshoba County, Mississippi, in the middle of the nowhere. He stops in Neshoba County, Mississippi, because this is the site where 3 civil rights workers were killed during Freedom Summer in 1964, just 16 years earlier. And so he was planting a flag, Ronald Reagan, right? The scion of conservative politics. He was planting a flag there saying, playing to white resentment and white racism and white supremacy and the most vile, violent forms of it, saying, I am with you. The Democratic Party turned your back on you by embracing democracy, but I am with you. And we're going to ride this into power. And that's exactly what they've done over the last 40 years. And so what we saw with Donald Trump and the rise of Trumpism, if you would, that's just racism and white supremacy playing out. There really are. And thinking about, again, this is why we're trying to understand race and racism in American society and say, okay, where are we? Where do we stand in the wake of something like this Capitol insurrection, in the wake of 4 years of a presidential administration that wrapped its arms around white supremacy, in which a white supremacist in the office, in the highest office in the land, actually receives several million more votes after 4 years of demonstrated white supremacy. Right? He didn't lose votes, he gained votes. And so we have to make sense of the fact that, you can really put those who cast ballots for him in sort of 2 categories. There's a smaller category, hopefully it's the smaller category of whites who are animated, who have been animated by this white supremacy. These are the whites who haven't been voting for, who come out and it's like, man, we are down for this. And these are not only those who are on the fringes of domestic terrorist groups, those who are in domestic terrorist groups, right? These are those who are animated by this white supremacy. And we see this playing out here. But we also have to realize that part of that 74 plus million are lots of white folk who are okay with white supremacy. They weren't animated by it. They weren't about to storm the Capitol, but they sure were okay with the policies that were rooted in it. They sure were okay with his rhetoric and what he had to say. And that's important to understand because that speaks to where we are as a nation when it comes to understanding race and racism in American society. All of it is just being played out right in front of our eyes. We shouldn't be surprised by what we see. We shouldn't be surprised by those who are animated by white supremacy see democracy as its greatest threat, because that's exactly what it is. Democracy is the greatest threat to white supremacy, because inherent in the idea of democracy, inherent in the idea of opening up the political process to all people, to all citizens, is that white folk will no longer be at the top of the pyramid. Right? Democracy is a leveling force, even when it's applied imperfectly. It's a leveling force, and that's what this fear was about. And white supremacy is all about fear. Right? We think about it in terms of putting one group above the other, but it's used and maintained through violence and force. It's about fear, the fear of a particular group losing, this idea of a zero-sum game, right? And that's what we saw playing out on January 6, 2021, but that's also what we've seen playing out over the last 4 years, and that's also what we've seen been playing out since the Civil Rights Movement. When have we not been dealing with this in the realm of politics? So when we're thinking about race and racism and trying to understand it in this moment, and why does racism persist? Why is it still in race such a central factor, informative factor in our lives today? Well, one of the things that we don't do as a nation, one of the things that we don't do as a body of citizens, as Americans, is we don't speak the truth about race. We do not speak the truth about race. Because if we did, we would be saying that race is biologically meaningless. right? The race as an idea, as a construct, there's no difference between anybody who is on this call right now. Right, we are all the same under the skin. Some of us a little darker, some of us a little lighter, some of us more hair, some of us a little less hair, but we're all the same. Scientists will tell you this: race is meaningless. It's scientifically meaningless. Right? It is a biological absurdity. It means nothing, and yet it persists. But speaking truth about race also means explaining that race is socially meaningful. Although it's biologically meaningless, it is socially meaningful, meaning it has, for the last 500 so years, created hierarchy in our society, structured our society, created haves and have-nots. It is the justification for the transatlantic slavery and so much of what we have seen, not just in America, but a global color line. And it still continues to inform our lives today. So while we can dismiss race as being biologically meaningless, and we should, because it is, we do have to recognize and acknowledge that it is socially meaningful because it continues to structure our lives and has for the last half a millennium. And it is also culturally relevant, especially in the American context, and this is critically important, that race, although socially meaningful in structuring our lives, that's the negative side, but we also use race as a shorthand in the American context for cultural heritage, for cultural ancestry. And so race becomes critically important as a language for understanding who we are as people. My people, right? Your people. In America, that's what we do. And as a result of it being both socially meaningful and culturally relevant, despite it being biologically meaningless, we have to avoid what we don't want to do. We don't want to fall into the colorblind trap. That's why it's called the Kerwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, not the Kerwin Institute for the Study of Hopeful Blindness, right? Colorblindness. No, you want to deal with the problem that has been born of and created by racism, drawing or separating people out by this idea called race. Then if you want to adequately address it, then you have to factor race into that, right? We can't fall into the colorblind trap, because if you fall into the colorblind trap and pretend as though race is not socially meaningful, then you're unable to understand the way in which our society has been structured and continues to be structured. At the same time, if we pretend as though race doesn't exist, the colorblind trap, people walking around here saying, oh, I don't see race, I don't see race. Like, what are you talking about? Of course you do. We know that infants as young as 2 and 3 and 4 months old are able to identify people based upon race because of the cues and signals that they're picking up from their parents and from their caregivers. So one, everybody sees race in American society. That's what it means to be American. You see race. And if you don't, if you pretend as though you don't, that colorblindness is not aspirational, but somehow is already here, then what you're actually doing is erasing people, right? If you come to me and say, well, I don't see race, I don't see you, I don't see your race, I see you as a human being, you ain't doing me no favors. What you've actually just done is erase me, right? Because you've erased the struggle and experience of my parents that was rooted in their racialized identity, having to survive and endure this transition from Jim Crow to the post-Voting Rights Act era. My grandparents, right, who struggled and endured during Jim Crow. My great-great-grandparents born in slavery and 1 foot in freedom. That's not anything to be ashamed about. You're not doing any favors by pretending that history didn't exist. That history is why I'm here in the first place. Everything that they did to survive and thrive made it possible for me to be here. So don't do me any favors by saying that you don't see my race. Seeing race ain't the problem. Discriminating against people on the basis of race, that's the problem. That's what you don't want to do. You don't want to discriminate people on the basis of this thing called race. You want to acknowledge and celebrate that cultural ancestry, that cultural heritage. That's where we need to be. That's what we need to be doing. We also don't speak truth about racism. We don't speak truth about race, and we don't speak truth about racism. And Kerwin does a wonderful job of and has been in terms of its work, both in trainings, but then also some of the wonderful publications that it has done, and saying, look, you got to deal with 2 aspects of racism. We got to deal with the personal, the prejudicial beliefs and behaviors that ties into implicit bias, right? I mean, all folk, I mean, no one is immune from the racial biases that define this society. Nobody, whether you're Black, white, Asian, Latinx, if you're here, you have internalized some of that. It's just a question of acknowledging it, recognizing it, and then doing something about it. But we often, when we talk about racism, we limit it to personal prejudicial beliefs and behaviors. It's the individual, but it's often more than the individual, right? It's also the structural, the way in which we have embedded prejudice in systems and structures. And here's the problem. If we only think about racism as being a function of the bad behavior of individuals, then we'll never be able to deal with the problems that are born of racism that then have been embedded in our society. So if you go back to the era of the civil rights movement and you see a Dr. Martin Luther King and thousands of children taken to the streets in Birmingham, Alabama, in protesting Jim Crow segregation, if you think that racism is solely a function of the violent behavior of the Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor, if Bull Connor is the problem, he's the only racist, right? And if he's the problem, or even if there are other racists, but if he's the problem, then the solution to segregation, the solution to racial discrimination then becomes very simple. All you got to do is remove the person. All you got to do is remove Bull Connor. But we know that removing Bull Connor didn't change a darn thing. Because, yeah, he was a problem, but he was a symptom of the bigger problem. He was an extension. He was a duly elected public safety commissioner of Birmingham, Alabama, just as George Wallace was duly elected governor of Alabama, just as Donald Trump was the duly elected president of the United States, right? Reflective of a problem. You can remove them. Last time I checked, Trump ain't president no more. And yet more African Americans are dying and suffering from COVID than are white Americans. And you got a very nice president in there now, and you still can't manage to get adequate or fair distribution of the vaccine. Those are structural issues, right? You took the white supremacists out. You put somebody in who's far better, right, when it comes to these questions of race and racism, and we still got the same problems unless we deal with race and factor race into how we deal with coming with the solutions that we have to our problems. So we got to speak honestly about racism in our society. And this is exactly what those protests were last summer, Black Lives Matter protests. And I'm gonna say more about those protests in a second, but where do we stand when it comes to race and racism in American society? We can't talk about that without talking about what we saw last summer, the largest protests in American history, largest public demonstrations in American history, coming on the heels of yet another police killing, that of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And part of those protests, tens of millions of people in the United States, followed by tens of millions of people around the world, seeking truth, right? And people are like, well, I thought this was about justice. Yeah, it's about justice. It's absolutely about justice. But it was also about truth, right? And this is why people were focused on taking down these monuments to Confederate generals, to the Confederacy, right? Because as long as those monuments existed, these are monuments to white supremacy that were born during the height of Jim Crow, or put up during the height of Jim Crow, some 50 years, 60, 75, 60 years or so after the Civil War. And then 50 years after that, during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, as long as those stand in a public place, then we are signaling as a nation, as a society, as a culture, that there is a place for white supremacy in this society. And that's not telling the truth, right? And so our young people were taken to the streets saying, look, we need some truth telling here, right? Truth telling about our past, truth telling about systemic racism, truth telling about the role and centrality of race in our society. And that's a phenomenal thing to see folk, young people especially, leading the charge, demanding that we tell the truth. What we don't do, we don't empathize with, again, this question of where do we stand on race and racism in American society. We don't empathize with bi, indigenous people of color. We don't empathize with marginalized folk. Just before this pandemic began, not too long before it began, and I was still traveling, I encountered, I did a presentation in Virginia. I wish it was Florida. Looking outside, I wish I was in Florida. But then again, I seen those COVID numbers in Florida. I'm gonna keep my ass right here. Look, I was talking to this teacher in Virginia, and she was fourth grade teaching. She has wonderful kids, and she was like, "Look, I have these wonderful kids, Dr. Jeffries, but it is clear to me that this generation of young people that we're raising lack empathy." And I was like, "Man, that's a big statement, right? A whole generation of young people, fourth graders, fifth graders, lack empathy." I said, "Well, what makes you say that?" And she was teaching in the class with mostly white kids. Brilliant kids by her, and I don't doubt that they were, with a handful of African Americans. And she said, a year or so ago, this was not too long before when we had all those encounters, immigration issues on the border, where ICE and was separating, family separation, separating children children coming across the border from their parents, locking them up in detention centers, kids in cages. And she said, she said, this is terrible. And I was like, I agree, it was terrible. And she said she wanted to have a discussion with her students about this. And she showed them some of those images. And as she is pulling up these images and news stories, she said the kids were just looking at it almost with blank expressions, right? Like, oh, okay, what do you want us to do with this, right? And she was shocked. I mean, she was horrified by it. Many of us were horrified by it. And she said these kids were just looking at it like, well, what do you want us to do? And so her conclusion was they lack empathy. And she said, that's a terrible thing. I said, it would be a terrible thing, but it's not true. I was like, these kids have empathy. They just don't have empathy for the suffering of people of color. And that's the difference. And she was like, I don't know about that. And I told her, I said, this is what you do. When you go back to your classroom, I said, I want you to pull up one of those late night commercials, right? When you're all up late at night, and I'm up late at night trying to read or trying to write, and you can't sleep, you turn on TV, you see Sarah McLachlan, right? So you hear Sarah McLachlan singing a song of one of these ASPCA commercials, and you get a little, you got a dog and a cat, and the dog ain't got no legs, the cat ain't got no eyes, right? Ain't nobody got no tails, right? And you're like, this is terrible, right? You text some money or something like that. I said, show that to the kids, right? Show that to the kids and see what happens. And sure enough, she did that and hit me back. And she was like, Dr. Jeffries, it was amazing, right? Like within 10 seconds of showing this little film with a commercial with Sarah McLachlan singing in the background, she said, kids are crying. They're ready to lead the revolution. How could this happen? This level of cruelty, this, that, and the other. And she was like, oh my goodness. And I was like, yeah, oh my goodness, nothing. I was like, the kids have empathy. They just don't have empathy for children of color and the suffering of children of color. Why? Because we have conditioned them to be more sympathetic, more empathetic towards animals who are abused than towards children of color who are abused. We have an empathy gap. Now, just creating empathy in and of itself is not going to be enough to end racism in American society. No, we got to deal with the structure, so many other things. But in the absence of it, you allow for the perpetuation of suffering. You allow for the perpetuation of policies that cause harm. And we're about to do that again. We have President's Day coming up. And we are creating a generation of people, again, put in what we're dealing with now, this lack of empathy. Why you can have so many people look at a video. And although a video of that officer kneeling on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds outraged many, you got many more who look at it like, wow, he shouldn't have been there, right? That the lack of empathy for human suffering when it comes to children and people of color. Where does that come from? Well, this is rooted in history and how we talk about history. We're coming up on President's Day, and we're about to do the same song and dance in which we condition our children, our young people to identify with enslavers over enslaved. So we're about to sit here and talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and all the wonderful things that they did. And we're not going to talk about the fact that each of them were lifetime enslavers. This is an image I just pulled up of the library of James Madison, fourth president of the United States, architect of the Constitution. James Madison was a third generation enslaver. Third generation. This wasn't some side hustle. We talk about slavery like it was like it was a side hustle. Like it was like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson were like Uber drivers, right? It was just some thing they did on the like this is the third generation. His family had been doing this for a century, for 100 years. This was in his blood. This is what he knew. This is what he did. So we're going to sit here and talk about and celebrate Madison and Jefferson. We're going to go buy a sofa and we're going to tell our kids, right, to go give us some fun facts about these guys. And none of those fun facts are going to connect to the fact that they held people in bondage, that they bought and sold people, that a person like James Madison and Jefferson and Washington all had the children that they enslaved. And this second image is of the brick wall of the mansion that Madison lived in, the same mansion mansion that this library rests, that this library is a part of. This foundation, these bricks were all made by the children that they enslaved, whose handprints are still embedded in the brick. That's the middle brick. You can see the handprints of the young children who were made to build these bricks. Now we're raising, and we have been raising generations of people who can better identify with the enslaver who writes the Bill of Rights and can identify with the enslaved people upon whom there's the people he enslaved that enable him to do the things that we then want to celebrate and admire. And then we wonder why our kids can't connect with the suffering of people at the border. We wonder why our kids can't connect with African-American children living in poverty, indigenous people, native folk living in poverty, because we've trained them not to. And by the time we get to the point where we actually want to talk about something honestly in school, by then it's too late, because they're like, what, what's true, right? It's what, we're not supposed to like them now. We be telling us we're supposed to love them for 12 years. We got monuments and memorials to them without ever talking about what slavery was. And that puts us in this place where we have that tremendous empathy gap, because we're denying the humanity of Black folk, denying the humanity of people of color in the United States. And this is also why we saw in the protests of last year, last summer, these beautiful murals that dotted the landscape. And this one is from right down the road in Cincinnati, Ohio, calling out Black Lives Matter. This is a call for Black humanity. Let's speak truth. Let's seek truth. Let's talk about the truth. Take down those monuments. Let's be honest. At the same time, we need you to recognize Black humanity. The only way that you can kneel on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the only way that you can invade a house and shoot and kill people in their bed, which is in the first time, right? We saw in Louisville, Kentucky, is if you do not recognize the humanity of those folks. The only way that you can beat peaceful protesters protesting for Black lives and the recognition of Black humanity is if you do not recognize the humanity themselves. And this ain't a new thing, right? This has been going on. Right? We think, what we saw at the Capitol, you know what that was? That was a lynch mob. And that wasn't the first lynch mob in American history. For 40 years, from 50 years, from 1880 to 1930, there is a period in which 2 to 3 African Americans are murdered publicly, are lynched every week. Every week. And you're like, oh my goodness, that's horrible. Of course it's horrible. It's a recognition of Black humanity. But you know what's also horrible? The fact that today, 3 times as many African Americans are killed annually by police than were killed by lynch mobs during the height of lynching. We have to deal with that. We have to deal with that too. I also need to deal with this dog barking in the back. I don't even want the dog, but the dog is here. But anyway. All right. What we also do, just one was last slide, and then we'll wrap up and we'll open it up for conversation. What we also don't do, we also don't connect the past to the present. Now, how the heck are we supposed to understand race and racism in American society if we pretend as though the past isn't connected to the present? This is a map, redlining map of Columbus, Ohio, and Kerwin has done wonderful work with mapping and creating opportunity, mapping opportunities and making the connection between housing and opportunity. And housing is critical. So where we live is critical. Connecting the past to the present, but through housing is so critical because where you live determines your access to opportunity. Right? Give me a zip code and you can almost predict with scientific certainty the outcomes, the life outcomes of the individual based on a zip code. That's insane. That's all you need is a zip code. That's insane. Why? Because housing determines access to opportunity, determines the kind of schools you can go to, determines kind of the level of public safety, the kinds of social services, the kinds of municipal services, whether you have access to playgrounds, whether you have access to hospitals, jobs, food. I mean, every essential thing determines is rooted, jobs is rooted in housing. And then if we don't, and if we just look at housing in the moment and not connect the past to the present, we say, wow, it's really unfortunate that Black folk are confined disproportionately to these low opportunity areas, right? High crime, like, how was that? Why don't they just move, right? How did that occur? Why don't Black people have more wealth? Average median white household has $140,000 worth of wealth. Median Black household has $4,000 worth of wealth. That's unfortunate. That's also tied to housing. But it's not just unfortunate because people made bad decisions and don't know how to save and invest. There's everything to do, connecting the past to the present, going back to the moment when in American history, and this is not in slavery, right? This is not Jim Crow. This is decidedly in the 1930s, right? Jim Crow North to a certain extent, when America says, all right, this is how we're going to pull ourselves out of the depression, right? We're going to guarantee mortgage loans. We're going to create a homeowner class. But in order to guarantee those mortgage loans, in order to create that homeowner class, we're going to racialize it, right? And so only those neighborhoods that are all white, literally all white, are we as the government going to guarantee these home loans, right? And if it's a transitioning neighborhood, you might have a chance, but if it's an all Black neighborhood, you ain't got a chance in hell of getting a loan, right? And that's just not unfortunate, right? It's not just unfortunate that suddenly you're confined to this neighborhood. You can't live in a nice neighborhood with a park and a playground, right? That's also tied to wealth, because the middle class, the American middle class is built and based upon wealth tied to the single and sole asset that most people have, which is their home. And so what we then created was a middle class that froze Black folk out. It just froze them out. You know, you're creating these suburbs and these levee towns, right? And you sell all the housing units, backed in part by government financing. And then you say, well, you know, good luck Black folk in creating and generating wealth. And even in those areas where they could buy homes, right, the homes don't appreciate in value because you're not subsidizing it by the local, state, municipal government. And so we have to, what we see today is a reflection of the past, absolutely a reflection of the past. But it's not and this we have to be mindful of when we think about, you know, how we talk about the present and the issues that we have in the present and the directions that we're going. You don't have this direct line of perpetual progress. That's a myth. That's an American myth, as strong as the American dream. Like things don't always get better, right? Like time, just let time happen. Time changes everything. Time don't change anything. Time is a unit of measurement. It's not a social force. It's not capable of changing anything in and of itself. And so we have to be mindful of what we're doing. We are actually not repeating the past. If we look at an affordable housing crisis, right? We're not repeating the past of housing discrimination. We're actually continuing the past. We're continuing the problems, continuing the policies in one shape or another that led to this predicament in the first place. That insurrection attempt on January 6th at the nation capital wasn't repeating the past. We were continuing the past, continuing this tradition of political violence rooted in a belief in white supremacy and this idea that Black political participation is illegitimate. That's a continuation. So what we have to do is we have to disrupt the continuation. If we want to get past this, if we want to move in a more democratic society, if we truly want to extend basic civil rights and human rights to all people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, if we want to extend human rights to all people, if we actually want to create a fair and equitable society, then we have to stop doing the things that we've done in the past that perpetuate inequality in the present. That's what we have to do. And one of the ways in which we have to do that is we have to connect the past to the present, which means going back to the last thing I'll say, and we'll open it up to your questions and comments, going back to the protests that we saw around Black Lives Matter. It was so critically important because what were people seeking, taking to the streets? They were seeking justice. Justice certainly for the individuals, the Ahmaud Arbery's, the Breonna Taylor's, the Tamir Rice's, and the George Floyd, certainly seeking justice for the individuals of police violence and racial terrorism, but seeking justice in so many other ways, more broadly defined for African Americans and for people of color. And that's what we need. That's what we saw. We saw a justice movement in the name of securing that for African American lives. And that's what the Black experience is. Black History Month. That's what the Black has been central to the Black experience from day one. Since Black folks stepped off those that boat in 1619 off the coast of Virginia, some 20 and odd Negroes, as they were defined in the manifest, described in the manifest, they had been seeking a telling the truth about their experience, telling the truth about what was happening. They have been seeking recognition of their humanity. You can only save people who you don't think are human beings, or you deny their fundamental humanity, and seeking justice. Justice in the immediate moment, justice for the past, and ensuring and protecting justice for the future. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and I thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions and comments that you may have.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jeffries. That was definitely a word for the moment that I think we all needed to hear and see, especially connecting a lot of the Native narratives and motivations around racialized violence against Black people, you know, in the past, in today, and being able to really make that connection that I think is difficult to make if people are just listening to news or seeing these events sort of happening, you know, for the first time, and really seeing how that's a part of our history. And especially as a social work student, a social worker, graduated from CSW, the focus on empathy was right up my alley as well. I see that same thing quite a bit. So thank you for that. And we will move to questions now. We had some people have some questions beforehand. Feel free to keep putting questions into the Q&A. We'll be monitoring that a little bit. And we'll be just taking questions up to about 12:15. And so I'll go ahead and start with the first question. Can you say something about the Republican Party then and the shift for Black people from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party and how that relates to what's happening today?
Yeah, it's an important question, especially because there's so much, there's so many untruths about that being spun now. The first thing to keep in mind is that African Americans, just like anybody, right, have no sort of undying loyalty or political allegiance. African Americans have shifted parties for any number of reasons over the course of American history. I mean, coming out of the Civil War, African Americans certainly weren't going to run into the Democratic Party, which was the party of white supremacy, which was the party of the Confederacy. That had just been stupid, right? And so they rallied behind the Party of Freedom, which was the Republican Party. And African Americans will remain within the Republican Party, those who could vote, as long as they could vote. We see that in the South up until the wave of disenfranchisement constitutions led by Democrats that rewrite their constitutions between 1890 and 1910 solely for the purpose of taking the vote away from African Americans. African Americans will remain within the Republican Party up until the New Deal, up until the Great Depression, at which point we see a wholesale over the course of 32, 36, 1940, we see a shift away, and it's quick too, right? I mean, this is less than a decade. They shift from the party of Lincoln to the party of Roosevelt. Now, they're still wary of these Southern Democrats, right, who are rallying behind white supremacy. These are the segregationists. These are the Jim Crow advocates. But they're looking towards the party of the New Deal, the party of opportunity. Now, the New Deal wasn't perfect, right? And the New Deal policies like Social Security exclude African-American workers in a number of ways, right, including agricultural workers, Social Security Act, and domestic workers, which was mostly African-American women. And so the Democratic Party wasn't perfect, but it was a whole lot better than the incompetence of the Republican Party. The African Americans were suffering just like many others during the Depression. But in the South, you had this dilemma, right? The South, the Democratic Party in the South is excluding African Americans. And so African Americans are pursuing the vote, they're securing the vote. And once you get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the mass registration of African Americans, the South is a one-party state. Republican Party is non-existent in the South, one, but also the champions of civil rights and extending democracy to African Americans were actually the National Democrats, right? And then they had their shortcomings, LBJ and the like, but at least LBJ had a great, had a great society, war on poverty with him and Kennedy, him doing a little bit more than Kennedy. I mean, that becomes critical. So African Americans then move, as they gain the right to vote, they moved into the Democratic Party. Democratic Party not perfect, Democratic Party better than anything else. But their shift, the support of the National Democrats, the Northern Democrats, the LBJ and the like, for Black voting rights, totally pisses off Southern white Democrats, right? These Dixiecrats, these segregationists. And so now they're like, well, what do we do? Because we are opposed to democracy. We are opposed to racial equality. We are opposed to extending basic civil rights and human rights to African Americans. And so the Republican Party, Nixon becomes the head, elected in 1968, says, you know what? This is an electorate that we can appeal to, right? And so Nixon and his strategists developed a Southern strategy, right, where they're saying they're specifically going to target white racists in the South, those who are animated by white supremacy, those who are upset by the extension of democracy to African Americans. And so we see, starting at the top, in terms of the presidency, a shift. Those supporters of Jim Crow, supporters of segregation in the South, the white supremacists, and that run the gambit from the elected officials to the Klan members, they go all in for national Republicans, because national Republicans are appealing to their white supremacist sentiments. And over the course of the next 15 years, we see a shift, right? So as African Americans move into the Democratic Party, white segregationists, white supremacists, those animated deeply by white supremacy, move out of the Democratic Party into the open arms of the Republican Party. So the white supremacy that we see in the Republican Party today, that ain't new, right? That's not 4 years old. That goes back to the white supremacists in the Democratic Party, right? So what's the Democratic? You often hear, Democratic Party was racist. Yeah, well, which party wasn't racist? But all the racists in the Democratic Party found a more welcoming home in the Republican Party once African Americans were allowed into the Democratic Party post Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Thank you. That was that was a really good answer. I think that's a thing I hear a lot, and that was probably the most succinct way I've heard anybody talk about that shift. So thank you so much for that. Someone was asking about the role of sort of the Tea Party turning into sort of the MAGA movement, and how that relates to white supremacy always kind of having a seat at the table in things like boardrooms, corporations, police, military, government, and sort of talking about that connection of those organizations like that, and connecting white supremacy into these sort of places of power.
Yeah, that's a great question. I like that framing of always having a seat at the table, because we know that white supremacy has always had a seat at the table when it comes to sort of America, right? And the places of power in American society. The Tea Party is interesting. The most important election in the last 12 years was not 2008, which was the election of Barack Obama. The most important election in the last 12 years was 2010. Because that was the Tea Party insurgency. After Obama's election, the coalition that elected Obama demobilized, right? In other words, it was like, hey, we got a brother, we got the man who we wanted in. We're good, right? Y'all go ahead. Now, part of that was the Obama coalition not tapping into and saying, all right, we got to go further, we got to go harder. And so as a result of that, you saw a mobilization on the right, on the far right, right? And then white supremacists become animated, right? And they begin to mobilize. Those who are animated by white supremacy. And this is all a reaction to the presence of an African-American in the White House. It didn't matter who he was, right? Him and Michelle. The fact that you had these black folk in the highest elected office in the land just outraged and enraged a significant segment of the white population. And that population then begins to mobilize. That becomes the Tea Party mobilization. And it is not about economic anxiety. This is about the social anxiety of what does it mean for black folk to be moving towards equality in American society. Now you have those who will, Republican mainstream, right? Now this is critical, because this sets up Trump. When the racism that comes out and is being expressed in the Tea Party movement, mainstream Republicans do not challenge it, right? Rather, they embrace it, right? Because now you're having an animated base. They're like, oh, we could use these folk. If they're gonna vote for us, we're good. Right. And so there's a silence, there's a quiet response to it. And so when you have the birtherism, which is rooted in racism, right? The illegitimacy of an African-American hold this office, you have folks like, well, we got to listen to see what they say. Maybe there's something, ain't nothing there, right? That was part of the problem, right? This false equivalency of every two sides to every, ain't no two sides to every story. There's a truth and there's a lie sometimes, right? And that was the lie. But we have the enablers, right, within the Republican Party, enable it, right? And they allow the lie to fester. And then who rides in and realizes what is happening but Donald Trump, right? The carnival barker, right? The snake oil salesman who sees the value and the power of racism in American society, and that it will mobilize this base. It wasn't until 2020 that I realized, Kip, that in trying to make sense of the 2008 election, 2012 election, and again, 2010 becomes that pivotal moment with the Tea Party insurgency, because this is when you have those animated white supremacists begin to mobilize and moving into formal electoral politics. And I've always been trying to figure out, like what happened in 08 and 10? Why didn't McCain and Romney win, right? But yet Trump does. I don't get it. And the reality is they weren't racist enough. They literally, to their credit, but the reality is they weren't racist enough, because the difference in votes was the racists who were animated. Like the American population that was animated by white supremacy, that was articulated by Donald Trump, that's who came out. They were the swing voters, right? It's not Obama people going into the Republic. No. It was the swing voters were the deeply racist white Americans who get animated by it and who came out, right? And and more came out over the next 4 years, because you're gonna have, we know this about political parties, you're gonna have a large percentage are going to vote for whoever the candidate is, no matter what. And that's Republican, that's Democrat. On the Republican side, that means, for example, you're going to have a large segment. It doesn't matter what this person could do, right? They're going to vote for him. But that's a different set of people than voters who are those who are animated by white supremacy, right? And you got to be the white supremacist on the ballot. When you're not on the ballot, then you see what happened in 2018. You saw a blue wave. You see what happened in Georgia, right? I mean, that's why that racism is so important. And the Republican Party, you know, we think about it, it's like they're going to have a decision to make going forward, because you're either going to rally behind the same person using the same racist politics, Donald Trump, if you want to stay in power. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that now, even after he's out of office. Or you're going to find somebody to his right if you want to be successful. You're going to find somebody worse. You're going to find somebody who's going to be even more extreme when it comes to the racial politics. They're not going to moderate. They're not moving more towards the center and away from it, right? Because they realized that how they were able to win, even though they lost, you know, these other houses of Congress, how they were able to win on an individual level was by being more racist. And that is a direct function of the Tea Party, because the Republican Party could have been like, nope, we're not going to deal with that. And they may have lost some, but they wouldn't have lost their moral center. And now they've lost that.
Really, really good point. Yeah, I think that kind of goes into this next question a little bit in terms of humility. You know, you were talking about the lack of empathy, and one of the audience members talked about, you know, one of the challenges to people, you know, really, you know, coming to grips with anti-racism is a lack of humility, particularly cultural humility. And, you know, they talked about challenges of, like, you know, talking to white people about racism, and particularly conservative white people feeling condescended to, rather than really taking a reflexive look inside. And so they wanted to know, you know, how can we try to teach and spread humility so that people are more inclined to listen and reflect rather than reject anything that makes them uncomfortable with their own past.
Well, I agree. I agree with the idea and the importance of humility, right? And we all should have it. I think we'd all be in a better place, right? If we a little bit more humble and a little bit more accepting of others. But I don't think the problem necessarily is humility that is keeping, you know, those who refuse to acknowledge the centrality of race in American society and the problem of racism in American society. Right now, I think it's two things. One, it's a refusal to acknowledge privilege rooted in race, right? And how white Americans benefit from privilege, from white privilege, right? It's like, white privilege, I'm not benefiting from white privilege, right? And people like, stop it, right? Come on, man. You know, one of the funniest things I hear all the time is people running around, good white folk, right? It's like, I've never benefited from white privilege, you know, I had to work hard for everything that I got, you know, I'm from Southwest Ohio, Southeast Ohio. And, you know, my parents, you know, lived in trailers, and my grandparents, they didn't have water. They had to drink from the Ohio River and all this other. It's like, how did I benefit from white privilege, right? And my response is, it's called white privilege. It ain't called white guarantee. You are not guaranteed to be wealthy and rich and successful in American society because you're white. It's the privilege is you don't have to deal with many of the obstacles that black folk have to deal with simply because they're black, because they're people of color. You could have gotten a loan if your family, that home loan, you could have got out that trailer if your family was able to take advantage of their whiteness. That ain't my fault, right? But the fact that you could still benefit from privilege in these different ways, like that, we need to have an honest conversation about that. And people need to recognize about that and get out of their own way. Like some of that's just ego. Like, I worked hard for this. Ain't nobody say you ain't work hard. Most people got to work hard in American society, but you got to understand that just because you work hard, there's other people who work just as hard, if not harder, who can't gain the same, who can't benefit in the same ways from society solely because of the color of their skin, solely because of what they look like. Right. And we may interpret that as, you got to be humble about your own success, certainly, but we also have to be humble about, what it is that our sort of station in life and how we came to be. And so the question of privilege is clearly one thing that is at play here. And then there's also, and the humility thing, I think does connect to ego, right? We got to kind of get out of our own way. And the other thing, Kip, real quick, that's connected to this and sort of, I think, as a barrier and as a block right now, is the refusal just to deal with truth, right? We're not, some people are saying it's a post-truth world, whatever it is. We haven't been dealing with the truth in a while, right? In American society, like our refusal to deal with white supremacy, to say that the biggest lie is that white supremacy right, is that there's somehow, that's going back to race is biologically meaningless, that there's some sort of difference. That's the biggest lie in American society. So until we deal with that, then it's hard. Like, how are we going to talk about policy when you have folk who are like, the election was fraudulent? Like, based on what? Like, what are you basing this on? And that, it's hard. You have a conversation when somebody's not dealing in reality.
Mm.
So we got to somehow pull people back. And I don't have a good answer for that, right? My answer is, you deal with power. You don't deal with personality, right? And that's a personality issue right there, if you don't want to deal with recognizable facts. So you deal with power.
A good point. I mean, that's you got to go right to the center of it, right? I guess that kind of, answers this question a little bit, but do you think whites today are more willing to acknowledge their privilege and power than previously? And if so, does this make chances for dismantling structural racism better than in the past?
I think more white people are, but you still have 75 million white people who voted for, all right, 75 million people, 74 million white people. I mean, you still had a whole lot of white people who voted for an avowed white supremacist, right? So I don't know where that leaves us, right? In this moment, yeah, you have more people who are willing to acknowledge sort of structural racism, systemic racism, right? You can, I got a little Alexa device. I say, Alexa, what's Black Lives Matter? And this will give me a very nice analysis of what Black Lives Matter is now, right? Which is great. So you have more people. We've moved forward in that, but we still are dealing with this idea that half the country is rooted in this and is okay with it. So yeah, that is a source of optimism, but there's a whole lot to be pessimistic about when we look, even just looking at voting returns and what people did in 2020.
Well, and, I think that's, exactly kind of where we're at. I think that question kind of goes back to what you were saying, that like, I think there's this divide between like, personalities and power. And, I would rather deal with the power first. And some people are ready to jump on that train and some people are just not. And so, you have to go with that. And I think this question coming up here is, how do we recognize that the university employs or any workplace really employs Trump supporters who may have power to supervise Black, brown employees? Even though we know, you can't hire or discriminate in hiring on political
right.
and know what you want to, but, how can we kind of, change and stop continuation of white privilege without the fear of Black identified people of color losing their jobs?
You can't. You can't. That's the reality of the Black experience. When has it ever been safe for Black folk to be Black folk, right? Whether it's in a job, what job have they not been able to have to deal with or live sort of in a world free of racism? When have Black folk ever been able to walk down the street and see the blue lights, flash and not be worried about it, right? There has never been a moment in American history where that has been the case, where Black folk could just live free and be safe. Has never been. You walk in the grocery, you look at the numbers. You look at the numbers, and like 7.5, white men voted for, 8 white men voted out of 8 out of 10, every white man voted for Donald Trump. I walk in the grocery store, I'll be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? Like, what is this? What does that mean? We live in a world that's just rooted in white supremacy. Like 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10, if you're being generous, white dudes voted for an avowed white supremacist. So what am I supposed to do with that? Right? I mean, if, we can either, curl up in a corner, we just got to fight. Right? That's what it means. That's the Black, you talking about Black History Month. What is, like, we was like, oh, let's talk about music and art and all that. Let's talk about how Black folk have had to fight for their very existence and survival. And that doesn't change, whether you're here at Ohio State or you're anywhere else, right? You just, and that's also, we talk about sort of, the trauma of what it means to be Black, right? That's stressful, right? And, people say, well, what is it like? Being around white people is exhausting, right? Because you're having to deal with that constantly. Like, what does it mean? What side are you on? What are you thinking, right? And then even if you're able to sort of develop an individual relationship, right? And that's I think this is a critical point that I didn't make. Is I'm glad I have an opportunity to make it now. Like, where are we in this, in the broader universe of sort of race relations, right? Still dealing with race and race. Where are we with race relations? Well, we're at the point now where white people can accept individual Black people, right? even the most you got Proud Boys, right, with a Latino brother who's ahead of them. They're like, yo, if you're white supremacist, I'm white supremacist. Like, we're good, right? So individually, even good, well-meaning white folk, right, can accept African Americans on their own terms as individuals. But so we can develop relationships in our workplace with people that take us on and treat us fairly and equitably and love us and care for us. Like, great. But that doesn't mean that they're going to treat the people they don't know the same way. We can still harbor those dominant stereotypes, still inform our interactions with those people of color who we don't know. And that's the place where we are. You got a little white kid in Delaware, Ohio, have a picture of LeBron James or some other African American on his wall and truly love this brother, right? And still hold all the stereotypes about black folk, about the black kids that he will encounter. And we do the same thing. And that's where we are. Is that different than the past? Yeah, it's different than the past, but that doesn't mean we are where we need to be.
It's a good question. Good question. We're getting close to the end. So I'm going to end with this question about what is the agenda for Black identified people of color for the future to dismantling racism? Like, if you were to kind of sketch out like what that future direction should look like, sort of post Capitol riot and post Trump, what do you think are the priorities?
Well, it's a number of things, right? And I think it is a list of priorities rather than one individual thing. I think first, in the realm of politics, thinking about this post-insurrection, we can't do what we did in the mid 1960s, which was overinvest in electoral politics. In other words, once African Americans had gotten the vote, we see that they move quickly, and this is really a legacy of Black power, move quickly to elect African Americans to public office. But there are limits to what you can do, right? Both, just as African Americans gain control of Cleveland and Detroit and other these places, we see massive flight of tax base and deindustrialization, jobs go elsewhere. And so we have to be mindful that we have to fight on multiple fronts. So yeah, we have to hold those who we elect to public office, hold them accountable, make sure they do the things that we want them to do. We can't just send people to public office and say, hey, now do everything that we hope that you would do in the first place. You got to make sure they do it. But that in and of itself is not enough. We have to keep pressure. This is why what we saw people taking to the streets last year was so critically important. You got to keep pressure on the other mechanisms of power within society, including, America, yeah, it's governed by politics, but it's ruled by economics. And so putting pressure on corporations so that they are responsive to the needs of people is critical. We had much less success. We, speaking broadly, African-American freedom struggle, had much less success in the economic realm in terms of creating shifts there, making sure that there were equitable jobs, pushing for minimum incomes, not just minimum wages, pushing for universal healthcare and access to healthcare. Like all of that, like that's just there's not just political solutions to that. You got to have social solutions. You got to have people taking to the streets. You got people protesting, people organizing, and putting pressure on those aspects of society through which change can also be accomplished.
I think that's a good sort of word to end on, a good rallying point for us to kind of go forward from this conversation with. So thank you, Dr. Jeffries, for answering these questions and for that wonderful presentation. I think these are the kind of conversations that I would like to keep having, in my circles, as we kind of move forward from 2021 and figure out, what are we going to do to gain power as Black Americans and to dismantle racism. So thank you. Give me a lot to think about. And thank you for our participants today for joining us for the conversation. Thanks for such wonderful questions. I know we did not get to everybody's question, but the questions that we had were wonderful. We will meet back here again in a couple of weeks to talk again about another topic related to race and injustice. And look out for the recording on social media. That'll be coming out, and more information on future forums. And in the meantime, on behalf of Kerwin, Dr. Jeffries, thank you for being here. Thank you for being here, panelists, and I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.
Thanks a lot, Kip. Take care, everyone.
Take care, everybody.